Hello and welcome to the annual St Nick's Talks Carol Service. My name is Andrew Smith and I work at Columbia Threadneedle Investments, which is just up the road on Cannon Street. And I've been coming to the St Nick's lunchtime talks for about 5 or 6 years now. And I know there'll be many of you here who are also regulars at the lunchtime talks on a Thursday, and there'll be many of you here who are guests who've been invited by perhaps colleagues at your work or from a flyer on the street. So I want to say a particular welcome to you as well. Now, just a few things to note before we kick off. Firstly, if you can make sure your phones are on silent so we don't get disturbed during today. Everything else you will need is printed on these service sheets you'll have on your seats as you came in. And also to say that masks are not required to be worn unless you feel comfortable wearing one, but just to say they don't need to be worn today. So from here on in, the meeting is going to proceed unannounced. As I said, everything you need is on your service sheets. If you could please stand when we get to the songs and sit for the readings. You'll notice on the first carol, Once in Royal David's City, the first verse is a solo, so please come in and join for the second verse by standing then. But now I'm going to open with a verse from the Bible written by the prophet Micah, who wrote this verse 700 years before Jesus was born. And it goes like this. But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times.
Once in royal David's city stood a lowly cattle shed, where a mother laid her baby in a manger for his bed. Mary was that mother mild, Jesus Christ, her little child. He came down to earth from heaven, who is God and Lord of all, and his shelter was a stable, and his cradle was a stall. With the poor and mean and lowly, lift on earth a Saviour holy. And our eyes at last shall see him through his own redeeming love. For that child so dear and gentle is our Lord in heaven above, and he leads his children on to the place where he is gone. Not in that poor lowly stable, with the oxen standing by, we shall see him, but in heaven, set at God's right hand on high, when like stars his children crowned, all in white shall wade around.
Our first reading is from the prophet Isaiah, who lived 700 years before the birth of Jesus. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shined. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this.
O little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie. Above thy deep and dreamless sleep, the silent stars go by. Yet in thy dark streets shineth the everlasting light. The hopes and fears of all the years are met in thee tonight. How silently the wondrous gift is given. So God imparts to human hearts the blessing of his heaven. No ear may hear his coming, but in this world of sin, where meek souls will receive him in, the dear Christ enters in. O holy child of Bethlehem, descend to us, we pray. Cast out our sin and enter in, be born in us today. We hear the Christmas angels their great glad tidings tell. Oh, come to us, abide with us, O Lord Emmanuel.
Our second reading is from the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew was an eyewitness and one of Jesus' 12 disciples. Now the birth of Jesus took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was to be found with child from the Holy Spirit. And her husband Joseph, being a just man and unwilling to put her to shame, resolved to divorce her quietly. But as he considered these things, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not fear to take Mary as your wife, for that which is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins.
Minuit chrétien, c'est l'heure solennelle où l'homme Dieu descendit jusqu'à nous. ciel est ouvert. Il voit un frère où n'était qu'un esclave, l'amour uni se qu'enchaînait le fer. Qui lui dira notre reconnaissance, c'est pour nous tous qu'il naît, qu'il souffre et meurt. Peuple debout, chante ta délivrance. Noël, Noël, voici le Rédempteur. Noël, Noël, voici le
Our next reading is again from the Gospel of Matthew. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Who is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When Herod the king heard of this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, 'And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judea, are by no means least among the rulers of Judea, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel.' Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, 'Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, that I too may come and worship him.' After listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their country by another way."
Joy to the world, the Lord is come. Let earth receive her King. Let every heart prepare him room, and heaven and nature sing, and heaven and nature sing, and heaven and nature sing. Joy to the world, the Savior reigns. Let men their song the sounding joy. Repeat, repeat the sounding joy. He rules the world with truth and grace, and makes the nations prove the glories of his righteousness, and wonders of his love, and wonders of his love, and wonders, wonders of his love.
Well, if I can add my welcome to Andrews, it's really good to be able to welcome you here to St Nicholas Cole Abbey. Very happy Christmas. We're almost there, not long to go now. I'm always on the lookout for good Christmas jokes. You can be the judge of whether it is or not. Here's one. It was just before Christmas. 3 men get into a lift at the Ritz Hotel. An honest politician, an accountant with a sense of humor, and Father Christmas. As the lift traveled from the 5th floor down to the ground level, one by one, they noticed a £50 note on the floor of the lift. Which one picked up the £50 note and handed it into reception? Well, no prizes. Father Christmas, of course. The other two don't actually exist. As I said, I'm on the lookout for good jokes this Christmas. So, well, as we approach Christmas once again, I thought it'd be good to spend a few minutes in that last reading that Michael read for us just now, to think about some of the characters in that reading. We hear about the birth of Jesus there. We hear about Herod. There are some wise men, well-known characters at Christmas time. And I think for Herod especially, I mean, the news that Jesus has been born, it's the most unwanted news ever. We can describe him safely as the king who hated Christmas. I think the first few sentences of that reading, they really highlight that. I mean, twice we get this interesting detail that Herod is the king. Verse 1, if you're interested in seeing where I'm referring to, you can see that reading on the service sheet there. The little number 1 in the middle there. Herod the king. And then on to verse 3, when Herod the king. So we've got a king, and he's Herod. But the wise men come to Jerusalem, and they don't want to see him. They want to see another king. And look what they say in verse 2, in the middle of those two statements. Where is he who has been born king? And Herod hates that. Verse 3, when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled. I mean, this new king presents a direct threat to his kingdom. And we get another detail, of course, which makes that really clear. Have a look at verse 2 again. The wise men say, where is he who has been born king of the Jews? And that little phrase is very significant, born king. Think about the monarchy in our country. Charles, when he was born to Elizabeth, our reigning monarch, he was born to be king. He's been waiting 70 years to take that position. He's going to have to wait a lot longer with the way the Queen's going. But you see, Jesus isn't some minor royal. His kingship, exponentially different. He was entitled to the throne when he was born because the throne was always and only ever his. You see, there are kings and there is the king. And Matthew wants us to see, here is the king. He was writing, Matthew, he's the writer of this gospel that we had that reading from. He was writing primarily to a Jewish audience. And for hundreds of years, of course, the Jewish people had been waiting for the king to arrive. They referred to the king, they called him in the Old Testament the Messiah. By the time he's referred to in the New Testament, he's called the Christ. It's just different languages translating the same word. And the claim that Matthew is making, the wait is over, the king has come, he's been born. This is God's promised king. And I think it's very easy, isn't it, to let the birth of Jesus just sort of blend into the background. I think this story in Matthew chapter 2 is written to challenge that. You see, Matthew wants us to see that when Jesus arrived, the world was shaken. Herod was rightly upset. Jesus just can't be ignored, shuffled into the background, pigeonholed. I'm sure Jesus is presented as a little one. He's vulnerable in these opening chapters. I mean, he needs the care of his parents. He needs a home to be brought up in. He needs the protection of his family. But that's all in the background. You see, Matthew has a far grander agenda than domestic details. This is God's promised king. And if that's right, I mean, that's the claim. If that's right, then I would suggest we should expect fantastic things to happen or to accompany the birth and life of this particular character. I mean, when this king arrives, if he really is this long-promised king, the Messiah, well, wouldn't you almost be disappointed if there weren't a few sensational things going on? You'd say, it's just a little bit of a scam, just like any other baby. And so Matthew shows us some of the sensational things that started to happen when Jesus was born. 2 points for us to consider briefly around the arrival of Jesus that first Christmas. The first point, I'd like to suggest that our attention as readers, even today, is demanded. See, the Gospel of Matthew, if you care to take a copy, we've got some at the back, you could take one away and read it for yourself. It's packed full of details about Jesus, his teaching, his miracles, his life, his death. They are remarkable facts. His life stands in contrast to anyone that has ever existed, I would suggest. You be the judge. Take one and see. But even in that reading that we just had, you see there are a few details there to sort of grab our attention again. I mean, first, Jesus is visited by, look at the middle of verse 1 there, wise men from the east. Remember, it's the ancient world. You don't just sort of jump on EasyJet and pop down to see your friends. I mean, nobody does that anymore anyway, do they? But in the days when we could travel, I mean, back then, travel was really hard. It was expensive. And these dignitaries from far away have come to declare their personal allegiance to a baby. That is remarkable. And despite what your Christmas cards may suggest, actually, we don't know how many wise men there were, and we don't know how they traveled. Clinton Cards reckons it's 3 on camels. It could have easily been 12 on elephants. We don't know. One important fact we do know. They're from the east. You see that in verse 1. Perhaps Babylon, Persia. They were certainly Asians. The original language, we might say rich Asians. I think there's a little variance there. You could even say very rich or crazy rich Asians. Sorry, that's gratuitous. I got 2 teenage girls. It says from the east. That's what we know. They're Asians for sure. The point is, these wise men were not Jewish. And that's the point to really grasp. They're not Jewish. They're from out of town. And they come to show their adoration and respect to a small Jewish child. And I think that's just worth observing for a moment. I mean, here are the finest minds of the Orient, the wise men. And for a small Jewish child, they risk everything. Here's the point. I mean, God's promised king has arrived. And he's not simply a local king over some people. This is God's king over all people. If you have one of those sort of globes, my children got one of those globes from when they were small. You sort of spin it round everywhere you place your finger, anywhere it might stop. From Alaska to Australia to Afghanistan, from Bombay to Bangladesh to Boston. Imagine, anywhere you go, here is the rightful king, Jesus. Attention-grabbing details, wise men from the east. Also, though, interestingly, a personal star. That's quite an interesting fact. And we might go so far as to say, I mean, here Jesus has his own satellite GPS system. Here is a star that guides people to him. Verse 2, where is he who has been born king of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. That's quite special, isn't it? Well, in the first instance, the star, it led the wise men to the city of Jerusalem. Quite generally, they arrived in the city and they asked. But then more specifically, as you read on, look on to verse 9. After listening to the king, the wise men, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. Now, there have, of course, been a ridiculous number of attempts to explain this star through natural means. Oh, it must have been a comet. It must have been special lightning. It must have been the Northern Lights. You can get quite bored reading all the alternatives to what is being suggested here. But again, I mean, it's the point that I made just a few minutes ago. Wouldn't you expect, if this really is this long-promised king, wouldn't you expect a few amazing things to happen? Here's a star. And it leads people directly to the place where Jesus is. our attention is demanded. And again, as I said, read on through Matthew. Be convinced yourself. We've sung in a few of the songs. Jesus, Emmanuel, that means God with us. What do you expect? It's going to happen if God visits earth. Abraham Kuyper, he was one of the few honest politicians that I've come across, not English, he was Dutch, and he went on to become Prime Minister of the Netherlands at the turn of the last century, 1901, I think he became Prime Minister. He was a committed Christian, and he said, there is not 1 square inch of the entire creation about which Jesus Christ does not cry out, this is mine, this belongs to me. You see, here's the promised king. His arrival demands our attention, but secondly, a response is also invited. Our story, of course, shows a number of responses. We've begun to consider them already, haven't we? Back to Herod, the king that hated Christmas. From his perspective, Jesus just cannot be ignored. He has to be eliminated. He's not going to have any credibility if he doesn't try and stamp out somebody that's born king. So he tries to trick the wise men. That's how the story goes, isn't it? He tries to get the wise men to give away the location. He claims he wants to come and worship as well. But of course, that's a load of hogwash. He has no desire to worship at all. And again, if you read on in Matthew, just beyond the reading, you'll see what he does do. He orders the elimination of all the small children in Bethlehem. Well, Herod's open hatred and fear of Jesus is rare. I think even in our world today, you don't see people quite as extreme as that very often. But I'd like to suggest the underlying attitude of Herod is typical. It's the attitude, of course, that wants nothing to do with Jesus, to push Jesus out of the way and irrelevance. It's what the Bible calls sin. I don't think you can ever understand Christmas until you understand sin. And very simply, it just means no desire to have any reference to Jesus. Herod, well, he displays sin very vividly. It's very clear he doesn't want to have anything to do with Jesus. I guess, though, the people of his city, they help us to see perhaps a more normal response. Verse 3 again, when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled. And then look at the next phrase, and all Jerusalem with him. I guess you got Herod then, the aggressively hostile. And then we see in the people of his city, apathy, indifference. A politically correct version of the same underlying attitude. Either way, though, Jesus is pushed out, regardless of your point of reference. You see, sin, of course, takes many forms. There are always ways of rejecting the rightful authority of Jesus. And the arrival of Jesus invites a response. Every Christmas gives us a chance to reconsider what that response actually is. And so let me begin to sort of draw to a close with a personal question. Who gets to rule our life? Who gets to rule your life? That's a question for you and you alone. Certainly our government, after yesterday's announcements, the government is very keen to give it a go, that's for sure. But actually, when it comes to everyday choices, how do you decide what you will do with your life? Who gets to decide what you do? We all want freedom, don't we? We want the freedom to choose to run our lives in a way that suits us. And it is right, of course, that as human beings, dignity means we should have freedom to choose. And in fact, that is something that the honest politician that I've been referring to, Abraham Kuyper, over 100 years ago, that is something that he believed passionately about. Even as a committed Christian, he believed passionately that people should have freedom of choice. I think he called it something like principled pluralism, where everyone had the freedom to choose and to make up their minds on religion. And that's a good thing. Apparently the White House, even today, the White House will allow different corners of the White House through the festive season to be decorated according to different people's beliefs and religions. And the atheists even get a corner that is intentionally empty, which is rather ironically appropriate in my opinion. But in the end, you see, everyone has to decide. You have to decide to whom you belong. You have to decide to whom you will give an account. Jesus' arrival 2,000 years ago, it challenges indecision. You see, if Jesus really is the king that Matthew is suggesting that he is, then our reaction today actually matters. It becomes personal. It becomes immediate. A couple of weeks' time, just under now, isn't it? We will be celebrating Christmas itself. How exciting to think we'll all be gathered around. Actually, it's just over 2 weeks, isn't it? I've got a little bit more shopping time as I sort of do the math in my head, a little bit more shopping time. Just over 2 weeks' time, we're all going to be sitting around and enjoying all the festivities of Christmas. And I love it. I absolutely love all of the stuff that goes with Christmas. The sort of the table with the wider family and everyone sort of enjoying themselves. Hopefully that'll still be allowed. We'll have to wait and see, I guess. The turkey, the tinsel, all the trinkets. And the crackers and the paper crowns. Isn't it bizarre that you have this sort of scene around most, maybe it's just my house, but around the sort of Christmas table and everyone's wearing their own crown, telling ridiculous jokes, slightly better than the one that I started with. You know, the situation. In life, we all wear our own crown. And in a sense, we have that desire to do exactly that in terms of making decisions, in terms of running our lives. Becoming a Christian, well, it's very simple. I mean, it very simply means recognizing that Jesus and not me has the right to run my life. In my sort of rather silly illustration, the crown of life, I mean, it means very simply realizing that Jesus has that right authority even over my life. That's quite a humbling experience. But the more I look at this king, the more there is to attract me to him. These details that we had today, they're not meant to sort of make us confused. They're meant to make us say, oh, wow, this guy is different. Remember, he was born king. It was a role that was designed for him. He ultimately has the power to do anything. But as you follow the life of Jesus, you'll notice something more spectacular than his birth, and that's his death. As you go through Matthew, I mean, you see Jesus intentionally using the power and authority that he has to go to the cross. And he goes to the cross to deal with sin, the very thing that lies right at the heart of my life, the very thing that makes me want to keep that crown on my head. Jesus went to the cross to deal with that. And so the response that's invited is like taking the crown off your head and laying it at Jesus' feet. Our story in Matthew closes with the wise men doing, I'd like to suggest, just that. Have a look, if you would like to, at the close of that story again. Verse 11. Going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and they worshipped him. Interesting. Notice what they do. They fall down, perhaps they would go to their knees in the first instance, and then they worshipped. That means they lowered themselves still further, prostrating themselves before this little infant child, as he would have been by that stage. The message is very clear. It's a very clear illustration, isn't it, of what's going on. All that I have, these lavish gifts, they belong to you, Jesus. What would it mean for you to respond rightly to God's King this Christmas? That's something to think about. If you're invited along today, why don't you ask the person that invited you? Or I'll say in a few minutes some of the ways that you may like to consider that question with us. We've come to the end of our Christmas time together. We've just got one final carol in a few minutes, and then a few other things happening. Why don't I explain that opportunity now? I brought with me these details. I've referenced the fact that we've got these Matthew's Gospels. We've got a stack of them at the back. They're quite free. Why don't you take one away? Here's a guy who looked into the life of Jesus very carefully. He knew the eyewitnesses personally, and he decided that it was right to write this account. Have a read yourself. Get to meet Jesus personally. Another way to just take things further, if you're interested, we run these courses here, free courses in the new year, called Christianity Explored. There's a little card at the back. You may just want to drop your name and your details on that. We'll be in touch with the details of the courses, but you'll see them also on your server sheet on the reverse there, just below our final carol, which we're about to sing. And you'll see those two courses. There's one online, one in person, and you'll see the dates of those. Just an hour each week for 3 weeks, a chance to really look into some of the details of Jesus. You can just listen or you can ask questions if you wish. I hope that might be of interest to some of you. Finally, we don't take a collection here. Please don't give us your money. We don't want that. We do have a few things to give to you, though. If you'd like to take away a copy of the gospel, as I've mentioned, or do please stick around for some mulled wine and mince pies if you'd like to. Now, one final carol together. Can I ask everyone please to stand?
Hark the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King. Peace on earth and mercy mild, God and sinners reconciled. Joyful all ye nations rise, join the triumph of the skies. With the angelic hosts proclaim, Christ is born in Bethlehem. Hark the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King. Christ by highest heaven adored, Christ the everlasting Lord. Late in time, behold him come, offspring of a virgin's womb. Veiled in flesh, the Godhead see, hail the incarnate deity. Pleased as man with man to dwell, Jesus our Emmanuel. Hark the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King. Hail the heaven-born Prince of Peace, hail the Son of Righteousness, light of life to all he brings, risen with healing in his wings. Mighty lays his glory by, born that man no more may die, born to give them second birth, born to give them second birth. Hark the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King.
And a final prayer. To the King of ages, immortal, invisible, the only God, be honor and glory forever and ever. Amen. Let me wish you a very happy Christmas.